We're just allowing Zoom to allow people into the room. We'll start in about 30 seconds.
Stephen, we cannot hear you.
Thank you. I'd also forgotten to record. So, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us at this webinar organised by the Culture 2030 Goal campaign. And you'll find out more about the work of the campaign and in particular its members, many of whom are fortunately joining us here today in order to speak. But the focus of our webinar today is on the Culture 2030 Goal, what we're doing, and what's going forward, and the work going forwards. And I think it's always a good discipline with these things is to set out what exactly our goals are, what we're hoping to achieve through our time together. Especially, I'm conscious it's a 3-hour webinar. It's quite long. We will have a break, I promise. But it's important to know what we're doing. So I think in terms of what we hope that you will get out of this is firstly, a deeper understanding of the role of culture in development from our perspective, both at the conceptual level, so why culture matters, what it actually means to engage culture, to talk about culture in the context of sustainable development, but also practically, what are cultural actors doing within the 2030 agenda process. But crucially, we also want to look forwards. It's in the title of the event. And I guess also because we are called Culture 2030 Goal campaign. And crucially, I hope that as we work through this throughout this webinar, we're going to start talking about how a goal hopefully can become a way of really ensuring the wider integration of culture, making use, really to taking advantage of the fact that culture can be this driver, is this driver of development. And I think a really important point that hopefully will come across here is the idea that it's not a question, it's not a choice here between a culture goal or mainstreaming, that we see these things as being entirely complementary. Another key goal here is that we want to kickstart discussion with you, reflection with you about how we can better understand and realize the potential of culture to support progress in different areas of development. So moving away from talking generally, but thinking about individual other SDGs, other communities that are really invested in making a success, how we can bring culture in, how we can make sure that through collaboration we can go further. And crucially, as the Culture 2030 Goal campaign, we don't pretend to have the answers at all, but we believe by having this sort of conversation, we can help accelerate progress. Finally, we want to talk a bit about next steps, both this year with the Summit of the Future in September, but also as we look ahead to 2024. What does a long-term plan look like for mobilizing all stakeholders to ensure that the potential of culture to drive inclusive, sustainable development becomes a reality? And really, we want 2024 to be a year of progress, to build on some of the successes that we've already had. And you will hear certainly about this, especially in 2023. What can we do in future? So in terms of the program, we are really, really spoiled with our speakers here today. So I think we're going to start with a little bit of the backstory, just for 10 minutes or so, about the 2030 agenda and the 2030 goal campaign. Move more practically, looking at how culture is reflected in voluntary national reviews and voluntary local reviews in particular. That we're going to try and make the connection more clearly with culture and other goals, the work of other stakeholder groups around equality, local government, inequalities, Indigenous people, policy effectiveness, behaviour change. Start to dig into some of those areas, identify key questions, research questions even. Then we'll move on to some overviews of what are the costs of the non-inclusion of culture. What does it mean if we don't do that? What will that look like if we fail to actually make this step now? Then we'll have a short break at around 20 to 2, universal time coefficient. And then finally, we'll move into the Summit of the Future, looking ahead to what's happening in September of this year. And then finally, look even further ahead to plans for what might be in a future agenda, and then close. Now, throughout this webinar, we'll be looking to make sure that there's a bit of time for questions in each. So please do use the questions and answers box in order to ask your questions. The chat should also be available. To be aware, we are also recording this webinar and we're also live streaming it so that as many people as possible can benefit from the conversations that are happening here. But I think, as said at the beginning, I really hope this is not the last time we have this conversation. It should really be a start of a new, deeper conversation. So without taking up any more time, I'm therefore very happy to move into the first stage, which is the backstory, the 2030 agenda and our campaign. So with that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Celia Fisher from the International Music Council. Celia.
Thank you, Stephen. I will share this task with Jordi Pasquale from the UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments, and I would actually like to invite Jordi to make the start and take us back into the past before we look to the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celia, and thank you very much, Stephen. Welcome all very warmly. The Culture 2030 Goal campaign, and I will share the screen now with you, has a prehistory. The prehistory is the period 2013-2015, in which we tried to have culture as a goal in the current Agenda 2030. We published in that prehistory 4 documents, with including a culture goal proposal and including an interesting analysis of the potential for culture in the SDGs. We released that potential document, potential place of culture, the day after the SDGs and the Agenda 2030 were approved in September 2015. Our campaign was born in 2018-2019, and this will be explained in the next segment. Ege Yildirim wrote this wonderful report in 2019 on how the countries, members of the United Nations had been implementing the Agenda 2030, including or not including culture in this period, this initial period of implementation of the SDGs, 2016, 17, 18, 19. This was followed by a report on the place of culture in the voluntary local reviews made by cities and local governments. We also published several statements since 2019 to 2023, certainly an important one on the campaign and an important one also stating our strategy for the decade. This was published in 2020. Our most well-known document is Culture as a Goal. We published it in Mondiacult 2022 with 10 targets and 5 reasons why we need a dedicated culture goal. This was, in a summary, the back story, and I now hand over to Celia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jordi. A warm welcome to everybody in this webinar. I'm Celia Fischer from the International Music Council, and I would like to share a few words about this zero draft proposal of a culture goal, which we launched in 2022. Why 2022? The world was then at almost halfway point in the 2030 agenda, and key UN meetings planned for 2023 and 2024 were set to shape the run-up to the post-2030 agenda. And 2022 was the year where UNESCO organized its Mondial Conference in Mexico City, 40 years after the first one, the first Mondial Conference, which was already a true landmark event. So when we set out to work on the definition of the culture goal, the notion of a goal was actually not yet on UNESCO's agenda. Mondial was initially set to anchor culture as a global public good. But here is what advocacy can achieve. And in the Mondial 2022 final declarations, the ministers of culture call on the UN Secretary General to integrate culture as a specific goal in its own right in the development agenda beyond 2030. So this was a major achievement already. On the eve of the Mondial Conference, the campaign launched the zero draft of a culture goal, for which we found kind of a working title, which is to ensure cultural sustainability for the well-being of all. This proposal draws on an international survey which we conducted throughout 2022, a survey among cultural decision makers, practitioners, and influencers. And we designed this proposal really to be the start of a process, as Jordi has mentioned, and also Stephen has mentioned, stimulating the debate both around the need for a goal and what this goal could look like. And today's webinar is another milestone in this process. So the zero draft offers a strong argumentation on why we feel the need for a dedicated culture goal. And we see 5 key reasons. First, to ensure adequate focus on culture at the highest level of government. Second, to ensure that the range of connections between culture and other policy areas are fully accounted for. Third, to ensure that the culture sector itself feels a sense of engagement in and an ownership of the goals. Fourth, to ensure that all other goals are activated and that their achievement is strengthened through the mobilizing power of culture. And fifth, to ensure that the achievement of all goals can be protected from systemic and behavioral barriers that indeed can be addressed through a cultural lens. The zero draft offers 10 potential targets, which range from cultural rights and the culture of peace to the preservation of heritage and the protection of diverse expressions. It also establishes the need to protect the rights of protection and to enhance legal frameworks, to empower indigenous peoples, and to develop a cultural approach in environmental protection and sustainable urbanization. John Crowley, who produced the zero draft on behalf of the campaign, will elaborate later further at another stage during our webinar. But I also wanted to mention that the campaign in the aftermath of Mondial 22 welcomed the strong commitment, the undertaking that was expressed in the final declaration of Mondial Conference, with another statement that was called Commitment to an Explicit Goal in Mondial Declaration Welcome. Now is the time to deliver. So the tone was set. And before ending, I just wanted to share something from the specific perspective also from my organization, the International Music Council. The rights-based approach of the zero draft strongly echoes with the values of the International Music Council, which are embedded in the 5 music rights and which are expressed in our vision of a world where everyone can enjoy access to music, where they can learn, experience, create, perform, and express themselves through music, and in which artists of every kind are recognized and fairly remunerated. So this was our little journey back into the backstory of the Culture 2030 Goal campaign. We will be happy to answer any questions if there are any. I haven't seen. I don't think so.
I don't think there have been yet, but I'd underline everyone, please do use that questions and answer function. All panelists will be able to see and potentially answer things in writing, but let's give 10 seconds for any questions to come up. Otherwise, we will then move on. Okay, let's keep the momentum going here. So and as I said, please, if ideas come up, and I think we'll be digging into these ideas in a lot more depth as we go forward, and hopefully ideas, reflections, reactions, positive or negative, will come up, and I think that's really helpful for us, because we realize that this needs to be a broad-based campaign. So for that, I'm very happy now that we're going to move on to the session on how culture is reflected in voluntary national reviews and other texts. And with that, I'm very happy to invite Gabe Caballero from ICOMOS, who leads on SDGs work there, to chair the next section.
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriel Caballero, and I'm the focal point for the SDGs working group for ICOMOS. As Stephen has said, we would like to continue from what Jordi has mentioned earlier about the documents that has been created. In 2019, Ege Yildirim has done a detailed review of the voluntary national reviews, and she did also that in the VLRs, or the voluntary local reviews, in 2021. And Stephen Weiber, the director of policy and advocacy for IFLA, has also done that for the VNRs for 2023. What we would like to get from our two speakers today is their thoughts on the presence of culture in these reports. So perhaps what I can do is that I ask Ege first from 2019 and 2021, and then maybe Stephen afterwards. Ege, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Gabe. I just set my alarm to 3 minutes. Hello, everyone. Wonderful to be here. Thanks for joining us. As was mentioned earlier, I was honored to draft with contributions from all our colleagues, from the members of the campaign, these two reports. First, we started out in 2019 for the VNRs, the Voluntary National Reviews, and the main idea was to put more substantial evidence behind the baseline, the status quo of culture's place in the SDGs debate, through both quantitative and qualitative analyses, because the subject of culture cannot lend itself just to quantitative or to qualitative. It requires both approaches. And the language of the UN, the language of measuring and addressing new decisions at the UN, a key tool is the VNRs, the voluntary national reports that many member states have submitted over the years. And we looked at about 135 reports at that time, the first 4 years of implementation. And it did give us very important fundamental findings. But the local aspect is crucial for us, for our campaign, and it has such affinity with the cultural dimension of development. And as the voluntary local review, VLR movement was growing, especially after 2018 with New York and some Japanese cities with their declaration. As of date, I think we have many dozens. At that time, we had about 73 in 2021. As we had enough VLRs to go on, we also started to analyze them and compare how the culture looks at the city's reporting level and the country's reporting level. I can only say a couple of more words as highlights. What we did find, there were several SDGs that came to the fore, like SDG 11, 8, 4, 16, let's say, but both at the local and national level. But it was quite obvious that all SDGs, all across the spectrum, culture was present. Some countries made a good effort to actually address some cultural dimensions, but it was much more, it's much weaker than the other dimensions, social, economic, environmental dimensions. We did a key word count with these words, having culture, cultural, society, social, economy, economic, environment, environmental in them. And culture came out at 5%, while the others were around 25, 30% for the national reports. When we looked at the local reports, the picture was brighter. We had 13% for culture keywords, as opposed to 5% at the national level. And we also did some rankings, top 10 cities, countries, just to give a little competitive motivation there. But I won't go into those because of the time. It's already 3 minutes, really. And at the end of that, we also set out some recommendations for both national and local actors to follow when they're drafting these reports. Just have culture as a consideration from the start, from the participation, the actors level, from the development concept level, and to measuring level, definitely. And we'll continue to keep monitoring, I think. Thanks to Stephen for doing a great job, with the sustainability of our reporting, because we need long-term data. And hopefully by 2030, we will also be reviewing culture goal and see how progress is there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ege. I think it's good to look at the national documents and also how cities are also looking at sustainability and culture as a sustainable development. Okay, Stephen, what's your thoughts for 2023?
Thank you. So to a large extent, it's echoing some of those messages that Ege was talking about the insights that these reports offer in terms of how authorities see the role of culture, how they see the role of cultural actors in development. And so I suppose from the 2023 report, some of the key takeaways that were interesting were, firstly, every single one of the voluntary national reviews that we reviewed mentioned culture. So there's not a single one that doesn't talk about culture. That's a start. I think we sort of picked out 4 ways broadly in which these reviews are talking about culture. I think firstly, there are a number of countries that really see their culture, deep-seated culture, as being something that is a determinant, a driver of who they are, what they are, how they do things. So the example from Fiji was extremely powerful, talking about the ways of thinking in Fiji being very good at allowing for the country to take a holistic approach to development. Secondly, we found that obviously, and I think especially with SDG 11, that includes the target on safeguarding natural and cultural heritage, there was quite a lot of focus on culture as a goal. But I think within that also, a number of countries talk very much about cultural rights and the importance of delivering on these rights, both as concerns traditionally understood heritage and tangible heritage, but also the rights to create, the rights to produce, the freedom of artists today. A 4th big category was around culture actually as a determining factor in the success of other policies. And so 2 very contrasting examples. For example, Ireland was very strong in talking about the role of cultural institutions and libraries as institutions which had a specific role, had a specific ability to deliver on a wider set of policy goals. But also there was Guyana that was very strong in saying that actually it managed to make its policies around sanitation work precisely because it took account of cultural factors, which I think we feel is a really interesting, a really important angle within this, that we're talking about cultural actors and factors in what we're doing. And finally, Portugal, for example, saw culture as having a real role in promoting the sustainable development agenda, allowing people to understand what it's about, why it's different, and why it's important to actually follow up on it. So I think you can really pick out these different themes, and none of these are really clear within the 2030 agenda, but I think through practice and through experience, we can see culture really coming to the fore. And I'm just going to share my screen quickly because I think a really interesting angle that we try to pursue, and this is one that actually is, it's taken a moment to load up. This is one that's interesting in the light of the work that John Crowley is going to present later on in this session. We also try to take a look at, well, what happens if you try and look across the different targets that we identified in our 0 draft? To what extent are countries already actually reflecting on these? And it was notable that actually all of the targets that we were talking about do appear in one way or the other. Some countries are stronger than others, some are less strong, but there's already a really interesting pointer to the idea that the shape of a culture goal already exists within voluntary national reviews. And so we're not talking about anything radically new, but we are talking about something that's doable and that hopefully we can encourage countries, governments to see as almost already self-evident existing. So I hand back to you, Gabe.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think there was someone from the audience that says that the great speakers and she's doing something in Greece, and next activity is to transform cultural wisdom on nature into small-scale businesses. I have one question, since I didn't see any question for this segment, and to Ege and Stephen. So you've seen the trends in 2019, 2021, and 2023. I know that you've highlighted those ones that are very, very prominent cultural keywords, but which ones do you think are not so mapped? And do you think that there are, let's say, issues that are more focused by the reviews or the reports, but not necessarily some cultural aspects are not so obvious and not so discussed? Ege and Stephen.
Well, let's just dwell on the cultural keywords that came out from the report. I'll just have a quick look at my reports and the documents here. Well, the dominant keywords, for example, at the VNR level were the culture of something, the culture of business, an organizational culture, a culture of living. Other than that, cultural heritage, cultural institutions, cultural diversity, cultural rights. These were encountered more often in the VNRs. In the VLRs, the local reports, let me just check that for you. Sorry, wait. It's been a while. Okay, so the 10 most frequent terms: knowledge, buildings, arts, heritage, language, libraries, recreation, preservation. We did see the widest use in the category, again, of culture as a general concept. And within culture, again, heritage, I suppose the presence of 11.4 enables heritage to be more quickly picked up. I think in the VLRs, something that we noticed as a big lack was the climate change cultural connection and similar goals, environmental goals like related to water and terrestrial ecosystems. For some reason, actually, the culture-nature connection is obvious to us, you know, in cultural landscapes and, you know, the nature as something we perceive as cultural human beings, etc. So, but somehow in the development world, culture and nature might be compartmentalized because there's much less reference in the environmental goals of the SDGs. Is one thing I should highlight here. Thank you.
Thank you. How about you, Stephen?
So I suppose building on the results of the 23 analysis, I think there's probably two key themes. I think, first of all, the idea of cultural rights and diversity doesn't always appear it doesn't appear as much as you might expect. I think especially given that there is an explicit reference to the importance of cultural diversity within the SDG framework, admittedly 2 words within thousands. And so I think there's potentially a weakness there in terms of seeing culture and the thing to achieve with culture as being obviously including heritage, but also more than heritage. Although I think probably the deeper one, and I think that really picks up on what Ege was saying, that there's an awful lot of references to culture of, and a culture of good governance, culture of accountability, culture of innovation, culture of inclusion, culture of entrepreneurship. But there's not much thinking about, well, what is the role of culture in changing culture? And I think that there's being honest, a lot of the references to culture are negative, and pointing out that there are cultural factors that allow inequality and allow inhuman treatment to continue. And there's not enough thinking about, well, how do we actually mobilize cultural actors, and how do we actually mobilize our understanding of cultural factors in order to change these things? Because culture is not a set thing, it's malleable, it can be changed. And arguably the best people to change it are those involved in culture in the first place. So I think a stronger look at that, a stronger look at how we mobilize, use actors, use factors, use institutions would be a really helpful next step.
Thanks, Stephen. So mobilization is really important, and that's what we're doing today. Colleagues, allow me to just ask the question from the Q&A from Matti Hakamaki. Hello from Finland. Could you elaborate on the differences between reason number 4 and reason number 5 of the document? A culture is essential for our common future, and thank you again for the great work. I think that Celia and Jordi, if you would like to answer, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Matti, for the question. Of course, both reasons are a kind of interrelated as we talk about the role of culture as an enabler and a driver of development. I believe that we focus on the more driving role of culture in reason 4, really about activating. We speak about activating the achievement of the culture goals, whereas in reason 5, we really suggest this approach of a cultural lens when we speak about development. And if I may quote, I'm sure he will say it also, but John Crowley, when we present the zero draft, likes to say, try to do it without culture and you will fail. So I guess this is the meaning that we wanted to convey in these reasons. Thank you again for the question.
Thank you. Okay, Jordi, you want to say something, or we can? Okay, good. So I'll hand it back to Stephen for the next segment of our webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Gabe, for the floor. And I think, as said, and thank you to Matti Hakamaki for putting the question in the chat. I think we really hope that everyone will feel willing and able and ready to do that. So now, I think, as I said, we've given quite a lot of perspective from quite a lot of the perspective of cultural organizations. And obviously, you know, we're going to say that culture is terribly important and has this major role to play. As said at the beginning, though, one of the things we really want to do in this call is start that conversation with people who are focused on other areas more generally or more specifically, and start to think together about what is it that we can do, what do we need to show, what are the research questions in terms of actually trying to underline and then trying to look at how we can really mobilize culture, how we can integrate culture, how we can actually use its potential as an accelerator of development. So in this, we have a range of different perspectives. I think we're going to have Ollie Henman, who is the global coordinator of the NGO major group and actually really heavily involved in some of the broader stakeholder mobilization around the Sustainable Development Goals. We're going to have Marta Jobet from United Cities and Local Government, who will be sharing some really interesting research into the interconnections between different goals. And then I'm very glad to say that we have Wafa Belgassem from the Civil Society Department at the Anna Lindh Foundation, who's going to give the perspective of the foundation on the issues of culture and peace. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Ollie.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I hope you can all hear me. It's great to join you today. Thank you. Thank you so much. So yes, as Stephen mentioned, I'm the global coordinator of Action for Sustainable Development. I'm also a organizing partner, we call it, of the NGO Major Group, and at the moment serving also as a co-chair of the whole Major Groups and other stakeholders coordination mechanism. So I've kind of been involved since 2015 in a number of different roles, and feel that, you know, we have a real opportunity at the moment, as you probably know, having hit the midpoint of the agenda, to really accelerate action and look at new ways of engaging. So I think this is a very timely conversation, and it's great that you are all stepping forward and finding ways to bring diverse voices and diverse perspectives to the agenda. So just by way of background, and apologies if you already covered this earlier, but going back to 92 and the Rio Earth Summit, there were 9 initial major groups, which included, for example, NGOs, indigenous peoples, women, local government, business, as well as trade unions, a number of key groups. And And those 9 have gradually expanded over the years. So in the Rio +20, and then in 2015, around the time of the SDGs negotiations, additional groups were added, for example, persons with disabilities, LGBTI, volunteers, older persons. So we now have a very, very diverse range of 21 different major groups and other stakeholders. And I think the really important point about that is that the engagement needs to be sustained and as diverse and broad as possible throughout the cycle of review of the SDGs. And that can happen from the national level through to the regional level and then to the global level at the HLPF. And again, many of you will already be familiar with, for example, the annual review at the national level. So the voluntary national reviews, normally about 40 countries step forward, and it's up to member states to choose when they want to do those reviews. And we're now seeing many countries coming back for the 3rd or even 4th time to do their reviews. So there is a kind of momentum building around those reviews. And we've supported over the years coalitions of civil society at the national level to engage and to provide spotlight reports or to provide inputs directly into the official reviews. And of course, through the major groups and other stakeholders, we also have the opportunity and the right for someone to come from each country to actually speak at the HLPF when governments present. So that's something to consider if you're already active. And I think you had a session about this already where you might be able to build and contribute to some of those national coalitions, because that's often one of the key ways to actually ensure that governments are truly delivering on what they committed to back in 2015 and following through on all the 17 goals. We've noticed, for example, quite often that governments pick and choose the goals that they want to report on. It's a voluntary system and it's very hard to enforce, and so they often will cherry pick the bits that they think they're doing well on, and they may not talk about the areas that are more challenging. And so I think it's really essential that we as civil society more broadly remind them of where those gaps are and highlight where additional action is needed, and also where implementation has still not gone far enough. And I think the funding gap is still a big part of that challenge. And we know that this year there'll be quite a few discussions also on the FFD track around financing and financing for the SDGs. So that's the kind of national level, first of all. Secondly, at the regional level, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the different regional forums that are coming up. So there's a series of different regional forums depending on where you are in the world. The ECE Regional Forum for Europe is happening in early March. And so if you are interested, it's worth also considering joining those regional meetings, because that's another good way to have a conversation within a region and identify other colleagues who might also be working on the SDGs. Most of the regional forums then follow the same agenda as the HLPF, so they will follow the goals that are under review in this year. So for example, we know that Goal 16 is under review this year, a number of key goals that are important to our networks, Goal 10 on inequalities. So there are opportunities for you also to engage with the regional forums, and each of those regional forums, so whether in Africa, whether Asia Pacific, whether Latin America or the Arab region, they all have a civil society day at the beginning. Normally it's a day or two before the main forum, where civil society can gather and have a discussion on key priorities ahead of the official forum. So that's the kind of regional level. And then finally, coming to the HLPF, I think, again, I'm sure many of you on this call have attended the HLPF over the last 7 or 8 years. And you'll know that when we get to the HLPF, it's structured in 2 parts. So the first half looks at the thematic reviews, the goals under review, and we'll be looking through the major groups and other stakeholders for key speakers who might be able to contribute ideas on each of those key goals under review. And then the second half looks at the VNRs, the voluntary national reviews, and that goes country by country. And each country is expected to make a presentation, normally about 10 to 15 minutes, so they don't have very long. And then member states will ask questions, and then we, as I said before, would have the right to have one major group and other stakeholder speaker on each VNR to raise some additional points, and those statements are normally drafted collaboratively. So again, if you're active in any of the 40 or so countries under review this year, then there is currently an open call for expressions of interest from anyone from those countries who'd like to contribute to a joint statement. So even if you can't physically be in New York, you can help to shape that statement. Then that statement is then read on behalf of all the stakeholders. So there are a number of different steps along the way, and I'll try to see if I can post some of the links, and otherwise I'll also send them over to Stephen so you have all those links. And yeah, I think culture is maybe an area that hasn't always been as visible as it could be, and I think there's a real opportunity here for all of you to really bring forward that diversity, that importance of cultural activity within some of the key goals under review and across all goals. Maybe it's something we could think about doing a session that brings some cultural performances as well. Be interesting to talk to you, Stephen, and others about that. But great to be here, and look forward to keeping in touch. Thanks. Back to you.
Thank you, Ollie. I promise I'm not going to sing for you, which was probably actually best for everyone involved. But thank you so much for that overview. And I think a really helpful thing and really a powerful thing that hopefully those of us on the call, especially from the civil society side, can take away is that there really are so many opportunities to feed in to actually make sure that the experience, that the voice, that the potential of culture is reflected, is talked about within that space. And so I know that's something that we're really looking to do and building on the work that we've already done and engaged. So I think definitely we're very happy to take you up on the offer to see what we can set up, Ollie. So with that, I'm now going to hand over to Marta Yobet from UCLG.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you all. I would like to present now an analysis that is an attempt to illustrate the interactions between culture and the SDGs. And this analysis is part of a chapter called A Cultural Boost in the Achievement of the SDGs. I will share my screen so that you all can see what I'm talking about. There we go. So this is the chapter, A Cultural Boost in the Achievement of the SDGs, that we, the UCLG Culture Committee, developed working closely with the UCLG research team for a report that the Global Task Force of local and regional governments presented to the high-level political forum last year. This analysis has a very particular approach because it shows positive but also negative interactions of culture and the SDGs. And by this, we mean that cultural elements can be used as an instrument to legitimize exclusion, marginalization, violence, and a violation of cultural and human rights. So we thought that it might be useful deepening this controversial issue and not only looking at the positive interlinkages. This is the representation of the analysis of the interaction between cultural and the SDGs. And let's have a quick look at what are the concrete interlinkages between culture and the SDGs. In the graph, you can see lists of statements that are related to each one of the SDGs. These statements are short sentences that illustrate real existing interactions, synergies, and also trade-offs between cultural policies, programs, activities, and the achievement of each one of the 17 SDGs. They all draw these statements from literature review of UCLG documents and also documents produced by the Culture2030Goal campaign. For example, the report that Ege has already mentioned on the analysis of voluntary local reviews, and also the report written by Andrew Potts on culture and climate. And thank you, Andrew, for bringing this issue on the chat. So these statements are placed above or under each one of the SDGs and highlighted with different shades of green and red, depending on their positive and the negative influence. For this analysis, we used a framework that developed the International Council for Science in 2016 in the report, The Guide to SDGs Interactions. And this framework uses the -3 and +3 scale. We omitted 0 because we think that it wasn't relevant in this case, since we didn't compare targets with targets. -3 is dark red and canceling, and +3 is dark green, indivisible. Other stages include reinforcing, enabling, constraining, and contracting. Let's have a look now very quickly at some examples. So regarding SDG 4, quality education, we have as a positive influence, a positive interlinkage, cultural actions in schools supporting critical thinking. Other positive are culture for peace, justice, and coexistence in early childhood programs. And as a negative interlinkage, sociocultural biases impeding inclusion in education. Regarding SDG 5, gender equality, positive ones, cultural actions, actors questioning patriarchy and traditional masculinities, or the promotion of women's access and participation to cultural life. And a negative one, cultural narratives and practices against human rights and democratic processes. Regarding SDG 8, on decent work and economic growth, we have socially responsible tourism programs connected to cultural ecosystems, job creation in the cultural sector for youth and vulnerable people, and negative ones, massive cultural events with impacts in heritage and infrastructures, or traditional knowledge and practices appropriation and exploitation. And regarding SDG 10, reduced inequalities, we have as a positive cultural policies and with a systemic approach on indigenous peoples. And the negative one, equality policies excluding groups because of beliefs and traditions. And finally, let's have a look at SDG 13 on climate action. We have as a positive interlinkage, culture to reinterpret carbonscape and facilitate behavioral changes. And the negative one, tensions between climate action and cultural practices or values. I think that we can further develop this research analysis together. I hope so. And we think in the UCLG Culture Committee that this may have the potential to strengthen our narrative and bring forward our advocacy task on culture in the global agenda on sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta, and I'm conscious of quite how much work that involved for all the people involved, and so to come up with something that is incredibly thought-provoking and just provides that structure for thinking through these interlinkages as a basis for thinking about how we can actually take action. It's such a fantastic resource. I'll just remind everyone, please don't forget to put any questions you have in the chat for now. Hopefully we'll have a few moments at the end, but right now I'd like to hand over to Wafa Belgasem from the Anna Lindh Foundation in order to give your perspective on the question.
Thank you. I would like first to thank you for allowing me to join this discussion. I'm learning a lot, so I'm a newcomer, bear with me. I'm just catching on all the great work you've been doing. So if I have to share something with regards to the Anna Lindh role, is that its essence, the existence of the Anna Lindh is intercultural dialogue, is peace, is dialogue. You know that the foundation was created right after the assassination of the late former Minister of Foreign Affairs by an extremist Swedish minister. So the real existence and the purpose of the Anna Lindh Foundation is to build this bridge through the culture. We are about intercultural dialogue and interfaith dialogue when it started in the almost like 20 years ago. So what we do is streamlining everything we do with this intercultural dialogue dimension of our work. We are an extended network of around 4,000 NGO and let's say not NGO, but civil society organization from the two shores of the Mediterranean. The member state of the Anna Lindh are 43 member states that includes all EU member states plus the South Mediterranean member state. And the programs we run are about creating and fostering and supporting connection and joint action around intercultural dialogue activities within those civil society actors in those countries. So we run different, like, you know, as many organizations, we evolve, we develop, we align to the priorities and align to the needs. So lately, our orientation is really to work and the human development of the Euromed space, but with these lenses and with this culture and dialogue living together as really the backbone of our activities. And then we have programs that really are specific to the art and the creative people. Like, for example, we have a mobility program that among its like objective is really finance creativity, because we see and we do believe that really that role, that culture brings people together, and that's part of development, part of our positioning. So I mean, if there is an organization that is committed and it's like linked to culture and peace, it's our foundation. But now we're trying even to create this link, and it's not easy, you know, when we work from the perspective of like big institution, intergovernmental organization. And I'm really here sharing with you the challenges we go when we start working on development and you know, the SDGs. So this is where we are now. We link in what we do with the SDGs, and I must confess, this dance is not easy. How we keep our identity as Annalind, and how we adhere to this discussion and input with the SDGs without losing for one or the other. How we can work on both with keeping this importance of the role of the culture in reaching or in attending all those goals, and supporting the human development in meaningful and sustainable way in the Euromed space, without losing and without instrumentalizing the culture. And that's not something easy, and that's not one of the motivation for us to open a debate, like to learn and to open the discussion. But we are very strong with the conversation at this level also happening through the network, because in every country there is a head of network for the foundation, and this conversation happens there, and it's like taken up at the level of the whole network. So I'm going really to be short here because I'm just joining and understanding, but that's where we are. The foundation is really committed to its role in fostering intercultural dialogue as a mean to support sustainable and meaningful development for in the Euromed space. But also we are, like you, trying to, like what's happening, not you, but what's happening at the globally now, trying to find this balance and this right connection and this strong link between culture and development. So thank you.
Thank you for that. And I really appreciate the point you make there about the importance of not instrumentalizing. And I think, I know it to some extent with it already it's good if we're getting beyond the stage where there's a great political, I don't know, there's a political meeting that talks about all of the goals, and then there's a nice cultural interlude, and then it stops, and then we just get back to talking about everything else. And getting beyond that is a start. But also, I think it's a really crucial one about how do you, because instrumentalized culture won't have the same impact. And I guess one of the ways that we in the campaign are trying to argue this is to say that crucially, it's by bringing cultural actors on board in the planning process and not just sort of giving them a task at the end is one key way of doing this. We've got about 15, 20 minutes potentially for questions here. I have a couple that I would be keen to ask the panelists, but I want to give people a couple of minutes to ask any via the Q&A section. Okay, so I think I'm going to start with one to Ollie, and I'm sorry, it's not one I've prepared you with at all, and I think you're still here. If you're still around and able to, I'd be really keen just to get your sense, honestly, of given your experience of working with the UN, working with all the different actors across the SDGs, how well do you think that the importance of culture, that the role of culture is How is it assessed today? Are people thinking about it at all?
Great question, Stephen. Thank you for asking. And I mean, I think it's quite a tricky one to give a straight answer to. I mean, what I would say is that the last few years have obviously seen huge challenges. I think the impact of the COVID pandemic is still leading to a long tail in terms of the responses by many societies. We know that education was very badly impacted in many ways, and many children were unable to get access to their full educational opportunities, and this has exacerbated inequalities in many societies. I know it's also been impacts on the ability of performers to be able to continue to perform, you know, and many theatres and public spaces have suffered since the pandemic. So I think there are big challenges out there, and I believe that, you know, that the kind of cultural aspect is not fully understood, and that the need for more kind of ability to weave together cultural dimensions into some of these other questions around inequalities, around education, around health, around lifelong learning, how we look at sort of whole pathway of someone's life and how they're able to interact with culture at different points, I think could be quite a useful addition that you could bring. And it might also refresh some of the conversations at the UN, because sometimes it can feel like, you know, we're banging on the same drum and not much is changing. So actually bringing in different perspective from culture might be.
I think we've lost your sound there for a second.
I was just concluding to say, yeah, interesting to see where this group develops, and happy to plug you in as and when. But yeah, I don't have a straight answer, but I think we can explore one together. Thanks.
Thank you, and fantastic. I think that reflects extremely well, and I think it's a useful call to action. I think again it comes back to one of the goals of this webinar today, is to start moving away from a situation where it's just culture people talking to culture people about culture, because that's not a surprise that they think culture is important. And how do we make sure that this discourse, that we're actually making sure that culture is part of this broader discourses? Already there's a question from France in the chat, but I'm just to give our panelists the chance to take a quick look at it and think. I'm going to ask Marta, so in the work you've done and drawing on these different sort of statements and arguments and research made, it'd be interesting firstly to get a sense of how far within this you're seeing voices from other sectors and people whose expertise lies in other sectors who wouldn't traditionally be seen as culture stakeholders making some of these points. And I guess as a second question to that, drawing on what you've discovered, actually, are there any particular areas where it looks like there's potentially a need really to focus? There's a need based on this to make sure that we're addressing negative potential factors and how, and yeah, I hope that was clear. Sorry.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I think so. So in the UCLG Culture Committee, we are lately trying to deepen this relation of culture with other areas. And so that's why we wanted to develop a report on culture and climate action, as I said, written by Andrew Potts, and also another one on culture and gender equality, written by UN Special Rapporteur, former UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, Maria Shahid. So these are two of the issues that are really important for us, but there are others. So we've been trying to gather all these kind of inputs from partners, from members of the Global Task Force of local and regional governments, to deepen these interlinkages as far as possible. And it's an ongoing work, of course. And it's a duty that we think we have within our constituency and also within the campaign. So that not only civil society, not only politicians, not only the UN system, but also ourselves can understand better what it is our implication in this and what are our responsibilities. And so, yeah, second question, I think that we found out that, of course, there are lots of interlinkages regarding SDG 11, SDG 16, which I think is really relevant nowadays. But still, we have to look at interlinkages, for example, with SDG 9 infrastructures. I don't know if you remember the graph, but we saw that there is no negative, there's no trade-off there for culture and infrastructure, and we believe there is. And I think that we should deepen the question of inequalities and the question of climate action, and that we saw with the report of Andrew that it has a lot of work to be done. I think that would be all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excellent. I can see that Ege's hand is up. Is that in response to this question? Go for it, and then
yes.
I'll ask one to.
Yes, sure. I just wanted to add the policy guidance on the SDGs that ICOMOS issued in 2021. There, we were very much aware of how cultural heritage specifically can be counter. I mean, it can have some clashes, for example, at the gender goal perspective. And the way that we had framed that whole policy guidance was at 3 levels. One, advocate the contribution of heritage for sustainable development, and protect heritage from unsustainable development. But the third one was critical: align heritage practices with sustainability objectives. So we were aware that heritage practices and the way we look at heritage had to be critically assessed from that sustainability point of view. And again, at the gender goal specifically for SDG 5, there were recommendations like using historical analyses to pinpoint in gender inequalities. So use heritage and history to face our current baggage, and use culture and heritage itself to overcome its own setbacks, let's say. So I think we have to mainstream into our own work that critical question. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I can see there's also a really good chat going on in the chat about involving culture and local cultures in particular in education for sustainable development. So do also jump in there. And I think I'll ask Wafa a quick question, and then potentially we can even dig into Francis' question in the chat. So I suppose the question to Wafa is, you've got a lot of a really rich network that's doing this work on the ground and getting beyond the sort of the grand words and the grand concept. I don't know if you could talk a little bit about, I don't know, really strong examples that you've come across where it has been possible not to instrumentalize culture, but make consideration of culture part of a successful effort to build a culture of peace, to overuse the word culture.
Thank you. I honestly, from the top of my mind, I don't have a specific case because I just joined it less than a year now, so I'm just learning and reading. But I remember, because before joining the foundation, I was a member like 7-10 years ago. I remember there was a very interesting program with, oh no, you're asking for cases for instrumentalization.
Well, I think both. I think even just to contrast examples of instrumentalization which doesn't work, and how do you do things in a more cooperative and inclusive way.
I can talk more about the inclusive because this is what I see every day, but the cases of instrumentalization I need to dig later. But the things like, for example, as I said, it works. We have this program, our architecture is built on networks of networks. So in every country, there's a network led by it. And there is this cross collaboration with the networks. When there are like really very hard conversation happening, I can take, for example, now what's happening in Gaza. We still have head of network that are talking to each other from the two countries in a very respectful and with this spirit of finding a solution, building peace, and trying to, with the limited space that is there, but they are still talking to each other. There is still collaboration. There is still interaction, not collaboration, because it's not easy in that context. But that's strange things that the foundation is having through its network. Also, we have this specific program that supports the national network to think and propose their own action and activities. And they have this, what we call in our program, cross-network actions and cross-network programs. And this is how we actually provide space for civil society, because it's through the network that we decide what we're going to do and where we're going to provide the support. So it's a bottom-up system put in place, so we are sure that we respond to the need of the ground. So it's our member who decide together over a year where they want to use whatever support we provide them and what they want to do about it, whether it's within the network at the country level or also with the cross-network activities. So, and we are going through really a great revival now, because many of you know the foundation from before, and now we are really into a very transformative approach to supporting, and we really listen, we really want to build expertise and recognize that it's our underground members who knows better what and how to do. So the biggest part of our work now through the new leadership is to listen. And I think we have, for example, I can mention we had a nice program on intercultural. It's called our common culture or our common future, which is 3 network members getting together, proposing a program, and it's doing things together. And this is happening in three components. But also what the network is doing now is really putting some energy and effort on advocacy, because that's the power of the network. So when a direction like, okay, joining an international campaign toward the SDGs is something that the network is aware of and wanting to join or to act, that's a huge power of either support to the whatever is the action globally, but also to learn from it. So I see a huge potential at the level of the network and added value, both from feeding with data or feedback or experience, but also in power of influencing or at least contributing to debates at national and regional level.
Thank you so much. I think actually it's a really powerful point there, and one that I think brings us on very well to the next session as well, that actually to integrate culture into any development, any policy effort implies by necessity doing it in a bottom-up way, because of course culture resides within people, culture resides within communities, and so if you're going to make culture a part of development, you are by definition localizing, you are by definition, you know, I'm very cautious about using the word empowering because it suggests that someone is doing something to someone else, so we need to be a little bit careful about that, but it's a way of actually, I don't know, leaving space for people to actually draw on their own experiences. So I think that's a really powerful message, and it's obviously a difficult one to pursue when you're talking about a global agenda that's supposed to apply to absolutely everyone, but maybe actually culture provides that way of squaring the circle, I guess. I'm going to give a few seconds just in case there are any other questions. Otherwise, I think we can move on to our next session a couple of minutes early, because I'm aware we've got a number of speakers, so I'm keen to leave the time. So in which case I will say thank you very much to Ollie, who's had to leave already, to Marta, to Wafa, and now I'm very happy to hand over to Jordi.
Thank you very much, Stephen. This segment will be devoted to the costs of not having culture as a goal. And we are going to listen from people from different organizations that have experienced in this now 9 years, 8 and some months, years of implementation of the Agenda 2030, the costs of not having culture as a goal. The first person I will invite to take the floor is Robelisa Halip, representing the United Nations Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development. Robelisa is in Chile. Now, she lives in the Philippines. But a prior question to you, Rogelisa. Please answer the general one on the costs of not having culture as a goal. What would it have happened to the indigenous peoples major group and members if a culture goal had existed? But also, please, in a very brief number of seconds, please answer also one question that appeared in the chat. If you feel comfortable with the title Indigenous Peoples as the name for your movement. Thank you, Rogelisa.
Yes, so good day, everyone. Our major group is not actually united. It does not have United Nations in it, but it's the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development. It's the coordination mechanism of Indigenous peoples engaging in the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, when deliberations were being done in the post-2015 development agenda, Indigenous peoples have already been raising culture as fourth pillar of development. It's not enough to have economic viability, social inclusion, and environmental balance. We have to have culture as part of the pillar to achieve sustainable development, especially for indigenous peoples, because having culture within the pillars of sustainable development reflects the holistic approach that we have to achieving a really sustainable development process. Now, what are the costs, no? If culture is not included in development, what we see at present is that, for example, projects, programs, policies that does not integrate culture, that does not recognize the rights of indigenous peoples as enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is causing a lot of human rights violations to many indigenous communities. Heritage sites that are being declared without the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples is causing displacement to many indigenous communities. And when projects are being implemented in indigenous territories without consultation with us, a lot of our sacred areas, a lot of our sacred sites, burial grounds, and our traditional knowledge are heavily impacted because it's not being taken into consideration when projects are being implemented. The impact assessments that are being done are mostly on environmental and social impact, but not looking at the culture dimension. And if this culture dimension of ours is destroyed in our territories, it has a big impact to our continuity as peoples and to the continuity of our territories. So it's important. Go ahead.
Yes, Rogelisa, in the final minute, what would have been the value of having a culture goal in 2015 for your movement, for the causes you are now describing?
If culture has been integrated as part of the pillar of development, then the approach to development would have given states and the UN a process where they could look at development not only from the environmental and from the investment side, no, but also from the cultural side, where when we design projects, it's important that we don't just look at, for example, knowledge, or we don't just look at landscapes, but we look at this as part of a holistic of a more whole process where people are able to advance their sustainable development holistically. I think this is an opportunity, no, for the Summit of the Future, where states are going to recommit to their commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. This is an opportunity for states to really include culture not just as a goal, but as fourth pillar of development, but also to re-emphasize their human rights obligations. At the end of the day, the SDGs is anchored to the human rights obligations of states, including that of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rogelisa. We, in the Culture 2030 Goal document, the proposal of a culture goal, we added a very clear target on indigenous peoples. We would like to work with you in the next months to more in-depth
Yes.
listen to the voices of your movement and to listen to you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the effort for connecting with us from Chile. Now I'm going to give the floor to Marie-Julie Desrochers, the Secretary General of the International Federation of Coalitions for Cultural Diversity, an organization with around 25 years of history defending the place of artists in the global conversation on development, at the heart of the 2005 UNESCO Convention on Cultural Diversity, and facing new challenges like artificial intelligence. Marie-Julie, can you take the floor, please?
Yes, thank you, Jordi, and thank you for this great presentation. So, of course, as you just mentioned, we work a lot with the 2005 Convention, which emphasized the complementarity of economic and cultural aspects of development, acknowledging cultural diversity as a fundamental driver of sustainable development. So as you said, you asked me today to speak specifically about AI and the threats and maybe opportunities that it brings us in relation with sustainable development. So in preparation for the Summit of the Future, it's pertinent to recall a key focus of the Common Agenda Policy Brief number 5, titled An Open, Free and Secure Digital Future for All, Anchored in Human Rights. This policy sets out principles, objectives, and actions for a global digital compact to be adopted at the summit with the aim of harnessing the benefits of digital technologies for all, while establishing guardrails and governance to prevent their misuse. These issues are central to discussions in cultural circles right now. Artificial intelligence significantly disrupts our understanding of arts and culture. What defines creativity are questions that we are asking every day right now. What is an author, an actor, a musician, a dancer? How can cultural policies and copyright law, for instance, protect human artists in this new environment? In the Common Agenda Policy Brief I just mentioned, we even speak about the fact that newer technologies are raising fundamental questions about what makes us uniquely human. In many countries, governments are trying to adapt. We hear calls from civil society to resist the tech sector's argument for feeding generative AI with protected works of creators without their consent or compensation, something that is unfortunately already happening legally in several countries. The importance of continuing to support human creation and not granting rights to machine-generated products is emphasized. The need to decolonize AI development and combat the reproduction of existing biases is highlighted everywhere, and strong advocacies for transparency are made. So what are the consequences of omitting a cultural objective from the agenda? The cost could be significant, as we all know. We risk homogenization, the weakening of democracy, loss of cultural identity, erosion of artistic diversity, and erasure of unique voices. In an era profoundly transformed by AI development, we believe that the only sustainable development possible is one that acknowledges the diversity of our cultural expression. Maybe just to jump on what was just said, I wanted to talk about really shortly a project that is happening right now in Canada, which is led by Indigenous data scientists, and which I find really interesting, and that is showing the potential of a responsible AI development in relation with SDGs.
In 30 seconds, Marie-Julie.
Yes, I promise. It is called the FLAIR project, which stands for First Language AI Reality. And it is, so as I said, led by 2 Indigenous data scientists who are currently using AI to generate Indigenous languages that are disappearing. So that is a great example of the importance of putting us all at the center of those discussions to link diversity of cultural expression and sustainable development.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Merci. So from your words, you are fully convinced that a culture goal would bring positive results to the global conversation on artificial intelligence, and at the same time empower key actors in that conversation, the artists and indigenous peoples.
Definitely.
Thank you. Now I'm going to give the floor to Rosanna Lewis. Rosanna from the British Council. Thank you very much. The British Council has published 2-3 reports in the last 4 or 5 years, all of them extremely well written, gone to the heart of the debate on culture and sustainable development. Rosanna, you are invited in 3 minutes to do a miracle, which is introduce those reports and answer the question on the costs of not having culture as a goal. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Jordi. Thank you for having me, and to my fellow speakers who have already covered a huge amount of ground. Yeah, just to mention that the British Council has been working and focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals since they were launched in 2015. We've been looking at culture's response and the alignment to UN Agenda 2030 as a kind of framework for the way that we develop our programs, for how we engage on policy issues. And we launched in 2020 the Missing Pillar, which was the first review of how our programs are aligning at the moment and what is the debate happening around culture and sustainable development. We then had a series of talks on heritage, on place, community, and this year, actually last year technically, in October 2023, we launched the Missing Foundation. And this is a follow-up report that really looks and observes the landscape of culture and sustainable development. UCLG's work features prominently alongside UNESCO's and other global actors, as well as more local examples of where people have been trying to look at this question of where does culture fit within the Sustainable Development Goals. And what's interesting about the report is that there are 3 sections. The first is this observation. The second is a provocation to the British Council about our own way of working, and has this alignment to the framework been successful or not in how we design, implement and report on projects, which is a huge challenge for a lot of us as cultural organisations. The third reimagines how we could be engaging on this question and advocates for a change of system. And I think the pact for the future is this moment that we can influence the direction of development policies and how we could re-channel the energy towards self, towards people and planet in a way that is based more around what my fellow speakers were talking about, human rights and values that encourage empathy, humanity, and solidarity globally through the fact that we have this cultural diversity that enriches us all, but it can also be a massive barrier to going back to the basics of who we are as a people on this planet. So it's a real provocation, and I just going to sort of the question of what's the cost and what can we do in this space. I think we're all operating within a very complex system that we need to recognise and work out what place we can play. British Council can be that intermediary between policy making and practitioners on the ground, between the thinkers and the doers and the influencers. We can work across sectors, we can acknowledge local contexts and embed people-centred approaches to the way that we work, working holistically and geared towards the future. So there's lots of opportunities that Ollie Henman shared before of how to engage. And I think the UN Summit for the Future is the next big milestone for all of us.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. Inshallah, we would like the debate you are suggesting to take place in the preparation of the UN Summit of the Future and the contents of the UN Pact for the Future go in the direction you mentioned. I will give the floor to Serhan Ada. Serhan, the president of the Izmir Mediterranean Academy and also UNESCO chair in Bilgi University. UCLG held its Culture Summit in 2021 in Izmir. Let me also say hello to Iseult, Linda, Tracy, the hosts of the Dublin 2023 UCLG Summit in Dublin. Serhan, your experience in the Mediterranean, of course, in Turkey, in the Mediterranean, all over the world, what are the costs of not having prominently, as we should have had, culture in the Agenda 2030?
Thank you, Jordi. Hello, dear friends, dear colleagues. Yeah, the cost is heavy. Let me start with that. As you know, I'm also an old-date scholar of international relations. So let me start with a simple, let's say, note that even during our webinar, the underrepresentation of the Global South, which I can only note and deplore, is a sign that Mediterranean, with its problems and its perspectives for their solutions, is maybe the place for us to look at. And that is why let me start with something which would lead us to the cost. I mean, I do believe also looking at the international relations that, let's say, international cultural diplomacy, or better said, international cultural relations are something, while the international arena of politics and war is something else, for sure. And while the national reports are something, on the other hand, the implementation of national cultural policies is something else. So we have to be diligent that even if we have culture among the SDGs, the struggle for us, all of us working in the field of culture, will only start because we would need this as a base, as we are now struggling for cultural diversity all over the places, despite, let's say, a convention which is there since almost 20 years. So I will base two concepts, if I may. One is we are often talking about cultural rights. I want to reiterate another concept which looks like being close but different. This is right to culture. We shouldn't forget that 3% of the world population are not living in their country of origin, and this figure is increasing. And more than 20% of the people living on the planet are jobless. So this has to do with SDGs somehow, and culture as a whole has a role to play. So we have to be diligent on that. And also we have to note my second observation, because we need strong thoughts, and not only ideas and advocacy, but strong thoughts. This is that culture has another role to play in the planet, because we note a sort of decline in national, let's say, policies at all levels, if not, I would say, a backlash. So the work done by UCLG Culture Committee, especially on local level, especially with mid-sized cities, is crucial for that. And we have to look very closely on the archive, which is being a very rich collection of practices, will help us for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Serhan. Teşekkürler. Now I'm going to give the floor to Dea Vidovic, the director of Cultura Nova and representative of NCAT. Welcome, Dea. What are your perspectives from Zagreb, from Croatia, but also as a pan-European network? Not only pan-European, global network as NCAT, on Training Center for Cultural Management and Cultural Policies. The costs of not having a culture goal.
Yeah, thanks, Jordi, a lot. So I would say that in overlooking the integration of culture into the SDG, as we already heard from different perspectives and different parts of the globe, we really opened the door to profound implications, isn't it? So this oversight extends far beyond the realms of arts and culture, as we already heard, and it directly threatens the essence of our global society. So the repercussions are unmistakable, not solely limited to only vulnerability and resilience of culture, raising the critical questions about the sustainability of the cultural sector. So moreover, it sparks a concerning decline in its relevancy and legitimacy, a matter of significance given that culture transcends boundaries, impacting numerous domains, as we heard. Culture is not merely a communication channels, I would say. Its substantial power lies in its ability to influence and convince across diverse spheres persuasively. And this is the most important when we talk about arts and culture. But I want to bring our perspective on behalf of ENCAC, the European Network of Culture Management and the Policy, and what the exclusion of culture from SDGs mean basically for the developing future cultural priorities within these global challenges, aiming to strengthen the cultural sector's resilience and its approach to sustainability, the urgent issues of public policy worldwide today. So consequently, the further erosion of the relevancy and the legitimacy of culture can result in reduced support for cultural institutions, artists, and cultural professionals, but also with educational gaps that hinder our understanding of cultural role in societal development. So furthermore, I would say that the community involvement can shrink further, hindering different participatory practices and the approach across the cultural sector. Then the potential of cultural diplomacy in international relations can be diminished even more, especially in the conflict resolution, peace building, maintaining security. We heard something about that. Embedding sustainable practices in the cultural sector and the cultural adaptations will also remain on the fringe of the priorities of cultural policy and funding bodies. In the context of the research and the cultural policy, the scope of cultural research can be restricted, and comprehensively, research can ignore cultural factors and aspects of societal dynamics. It significantly hampers collaboration within the interdisciplinary transversal domains of the cultural management, the policy, education, and the research. And in essence, it creates a barrier to the synergy needed for effective cultural management and the policy research, hindering our capacity to develop a comprehensive solution that address the complexity of contemporary global issues. And finally, I will finish with the last consequence as a result of all this missing aspect, that the current rhetoric and the implication of the cultural policy, which is very conservative and traditional yet, will remain inadequate in realizing the profound changes required to transform the art world and the cultural sector into a less elitist, more inclusive, democratic, and just domain. That some of that aspect is already mentioned by Rosanna as well, and Serhan and many other speakers earlier.
Thank you, Havala. We take note, and we will, yes, work in this direction too. Victoria Okogie, welcome. You are a librarian and you are a member of the IFLA Global Libraries Board. From your perspective, what are the costs of not having culture in the Agenda 2030 as we all believe it should have been in a prominent place and probably with a culture goal? Victoria, you have the floor. You are muted, Victoria.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me start by congratulating the organizers for organizing this forum and for inviting IFLA to speak. My name is Victoria Okogie, and I lecture at the University of Abuja in Nigeria. As a former president, excuse me, as a former president of the Nigerian Library Association, former chair of IFLA Africa section, and a former member of the IFLA governing board, I have worked over time to promote access to information, and I have been engaged in evidence-based research to demonstrate the role of libraries in access to information and the role of libraries as cultural spaces in the development agenda. I am a member of the International Advisory Committee of UNESCO Memory of the World Program that promotes the preservation of documentary heritage, and also a member of the 16 IFLA Global Libraries Board, as you earlier mentioned. Making the most of the few minutes that I have today, I would like to quickly stress 4 key points why non-inclusion of libraries as tools for achieving the SDGs will be a very costly error. First, libraries are by their nature cultural spaces which make them more welcoming, attractive, and accessible to communities, and so allow them to support people's development in different ways, especially in pursuing individual wider goals such as in learning, education, and employment. Without considering such spaces, we lose a key means of achieving the SDGs. Secondly, library collections are not just essential for allowing people to fulfill their rights, and in particular their cultural rights, but are necessary for building social cohesion and are a key raw material for research, for example, into climate change. Lose this, and we hold back innovation and scientific progress. Thirdly, libraries, and indeed librarians, have a specific role and mission to understand the cultures of the communities they serve. This is essential if we are to pursue our missions in effective ways that deliver results which are better than distant top-down solutions. If we lose these cultural understandings, this comes at the cost of policy effectiveness. Lastly, I cannot overemphasize that libraries have long been engaged around the SDGs. Therefore, as cultural institutions and actors, they must be seen as development accelerators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you very much for the effort of in condensating these arguments in a very acute and strong way. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to give the floor to Valeria Marcolin. Valeria, in the last 25 years, you have been very present in the exchanges between the North and the South, between mainly Europe and Africa. And you have a strong position also on why we need a culture goal. And certainly you have suffered the costs of not having culture identified, recognized as a vector of development with specific targets. Please take the floor, explain your experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jordi, and thank you again, as others said, to the organizer for this webinar. As you said, that I think you said it already, a very important point I was going to make. Indeed, I'm co-directing Culture2030Goal, which is an NGO based in France, but acting internationally in bridging the so-called North-South cooperation through culture. But we are now advocating to really get out from this old paradigm of global North, global South, because we are now within an environment of a common agenda, common goals, global challenges that, of course, we need to address locally through different means, but that are also opportunities to bring our societies and our communities closer. So we strongly believe that the language we use is also a key potential threat, fostering division, fostering separation, fostering stereotypes. So we are now launching a campaign for a common language, for a common agenda. So this is the first message to open the floor. And this is also the reason for why the lack of a potential future common goal we are advocating for altogether since year is a threat to the future, because I think that it was mentioned before, we have seen how not taking into consideration culture in the raising of the digital tools and the digital transformation, artificial intelligence from the beginning is now asking us to working aftermaths. And so how to catch up with some trends that are threatening cultural diversity in the digital era. So we should not make the same mistake with the new campaign, with the new agenda that will follow the 2015 agenda. And I would say that the first leg would be the leg of wonderful creative projects inspired by the SDGs, because personally, we use SDGs as a playground for inventing new projects, exactly because they bring sectors together, they allow organizations from different sectors, politicians to work with civil society, thanks to SDG 17. So I would say that the first missing opportunities we would have is to have new projects that are more focused on culture per se, rather than focusing on the transversal dimension of culture, which of course is important, but is not addressing the challenges of the cultural and creative sectors on one hand, and on the other hand, as Saran was saying, the right to access to culture for all in our territories. So I think that this would be the first main important point. The second one is that we see,
in 30 seconds, Valeria,
of
please.
course. The second one in 30 seconds is that we see how much we have improved the consideration of gender and youth in global agendas and projects since we start to highlight priorities such as gender and youth. Priorities and indicators have really been game changers, for example, for those two targets. So not having a clear goal for culture also means that we will not be able to measure improvement in terms of cultural policies, and we are very much aware of the threats that this represents. Of course, always framing these cultural policies within the spirits of, for example, the 2005 Convention in the respects of human rights, inclusiveness, fair access to culture, and promotion of the diversity of cultural expressions that are basic need in every territory.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Valeria. And to close this segment, I will give the floor to Eva Zimmermann, the director of the Agenda 2030 of the Eurométropole de Strasbourg, the city that, member of UCLG, that in its delivery of the Agenda 2030 decided there should be a goal 18, culture. Can you tell us why you decided this? And then you will certainly answer the question, the costs of not having culture in Strasbourg. Merci.
Yes, thank you, Jordi, for giving Strasbourg the floor, and very, very happy to share with you our experience. Yes, for sure, we have worked on SDGs since 2018. And our first goal was to make, with the SDG framework, a governance framework. And in this way, we started with budgeting situation, and we looked where the money goes. And as we've done this, we found out that there were some missing gaps, missing points in the SDGs. And one of them was, for sure, culture. And we decided to build this 18th goal for culture, because there was a pledge for the goal also at worldwide. And we discovered other missing points, such as sports or noise or everything. So we added a lot of targets, 5 other targets, and this SDG itself as a culture goal. And yes, we are since there working on these targets, but I have to say that the targets which were proposed were not fitting really what we are doing here at local level. That's why I think we have to build a better operational set of targets at local level, and we are going to do this at next year. Because we are going to be the next World Book Capital next year in 2024. So we are using this mobilization to engage the discussions with local stakeholders on SDG journey to build our framework at local level on what should be these targets. And I say, I think we are going to enlarge a little bit the spectrum of the culture. It's not only culture as activity sector, it's culture in a whole on a certain kind of a model of a society. It's what we are sharing together as a community, what we value really, and what we value has changed since the last pandemic of COVID-19. The priority has changed in the people's perspective, also at local level perspective. So in this way, we should really build a space of multilateral dialogue also to build this new set of values. It's more a philosophical question than an issue of a cultural sector. That's why, yes, I think what we have lost since 2015 is more a lot of time. Sorry to say this, and probably a global comprehension of what the SDG means. The meaning for SDG framework is a transformative framework. We have to transform our society to achieve the goals. So in this way, I think the cultural goal should be a cross-cutting goal, just like the SDG 11 for the cities. It should be more a goal of value, social cohesion, and global comprehension of what is our future, because our future is not only a set of anxious difficulties and issues, it's also a narrative for the future which should be positive and engaging.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. If the World Book Capital is this year, 2024, not next year.
Yes, this year, yes, 2024.
2024.
Yes, but it begins only in April.
Okay.
Until next April 2025.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the break for 3-4 minutes, let me apologize Babilas Ndiaye, the president of the Arterial Network. He is in the room, but he cannot take the floor. So Babilas, we wish you are recovered very soon, and happy to welcome you as new president of Arterial. I think this is time for a break, and Lars Ebert, the Secretary General of Culture Action Europe, will take the next segment in 3-4 minutes. But this is now time for a break. Coffee, tea, toilet, whatever. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I guess that was the sign to get started slowly, slowly. Yeah. Okay, let's see. It's probably hard to catch up with the schedule, but let's try our best to be as brief as possible. Thanks, Jordi, Stephen, and all other colleagues from the campaign and all previous speakers. It has been a privilege to follow this webinar so far. My name is Lars. I'm Secretary General of Culture Action Europe, one of the partners of the global campaign, which is really an important campaign for us, if not the important campaign for us to engage in. As you know, we are a network that advocates for a stronger role for culture in the future of Europe. And when we look at that, we see a similar dynamics that we need culture represented in all policy areas, but that only works if it is properly empowered by its own domain. And there we see a very complementary dynamic in the Culture Goal campaign that we need to implement and use in our European advocacy. This session is about the UN Summit of the Future, and we'll dive right into it this year, coming up in September. It's the run-up to the summit. I've been reading on their website, summit, that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and that the summit is about the how, because we would know the what already. Now, I guess our campaign somehow questions that, because I think the what, in our view, is lacking the 18th goal, the culture goal. So in a way, this session is maybe also how we can put in the question about the what in the how approach of the summit. I'm glad to have as a first speaker Paola Leoncini Bartoli, Director of Cultural Policies and Development at the UNESCO. And I'll just immediately ask you, and you've got in total 5 minutes, and if it's less, then we will be very happy as well. Since Mondial Culture in 2022, UNESCO has been advocating for a culture goal. And it seems the next important step is indeed the summit in September, the UN summit. How is UNESCO preparing that summit and the pact for the future that will be approved at the summit? The word is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I hope
yes,
you can.
Very well.
Right. So thank you, Lars, and thank you, Jordi, and all those present for this wonderful opportunity that is given to UNESCO to be with you on the Culture 2030 Goal campaign and to contribute towards a joint advocacy on culture in the post-2030 development agenda. I'll try to respect my 5 minutes time, and so please apologies if you feel that I'm running a bit in my sharing UNESCO's views. I wish to focus my intervention on providing an overview on the inclusion of culture precisely in the post-2030 agenda from UNESCO's perspective. Now, let's go back very quickly to the endorsement of the 2030 agenda in 2015. It seems very far away. There has been a deep reconfiguration of the global geopolitical landscape that is calling for a renewed culturally diverse multilateralism. And this is the entry point for us, and the critical entry point. This shift calls for culture to be at the center stage of efforts to acknowledge that new players have joined the global discourse with their specificities, and countries that bring to the table new models of sustainable development, new approaches that move away from all-size-fits-all frameworks. At the same time, the attainment of the SDGs has suffered significant setbacks, and we all agree on this, calling in particular for a greater localization of development and of development plans, which is exactly what culture provides, through more context-relevant and people-centered approaches. In this sense, the absence of culture was underlined as a major implementation gap to be addressed, as reflected in the UN Secretary General report, Progress Towards the Sustainable Development Goals, a rescue plan for people and the planet. In the context of these implementation gaps, recent years have witnessed an increased emphasis on culture's role in sustainable development across several policy fora. Let me just mention a few of them: the G20, the G7, the BRICS Summit, Mondiacult, and many others, including at the sub-regional level. As you know, the call to work towards a standalone culture goal was explicitly voiced by countries in Mondiacult, as you mentioned, Lars, and precisely in the ministerial declaration. In that light, UNESCO has engaged in advocacy efforts to include culture as a central pillar of the post-2030 development agenda. The Pact for the Future is, we consider, a unique opportunity not to miss the train, and to do that, as it will be adopted by the UN member states in September during the Summit of the Future, and will set the basis for the post-2030 agenda precisely. In this context, last month, UNESCO was tasked by the UN Secretary General to take the lead and coordinate efforts with OHCHR, which I remind you all is the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and UNDESA, to support the inclusion of culture in the Pact for the Future as part of the member state-led negotiation that have started this month. Now, we were requested very specifically in December to provide language that was prepared by UNESCO together with OHCHR and DESA along the 5 chapters of the Pact for the Future, which is online, and we are actively mobilizing member states in New York as we speak. Let me share with you the intergovernmental negotiations calendar for UN member states, which is very tight. The 0 draft will be circulated by the co-facilitators. I wish to remind you that these are Germany and Namibia, and it will be circulated to all UN member states in the coming days. Between the 6th and the 9th of February, UN member states will meet behind closed doors and discuss the text. Written inputs shall be sent by all UN member states no later than 12 February. That is why the time frame is very tight. 12 February. Against this backdrop, I wish to share some proposals for joint advocacy to be taken forward in the coming months, as the input and efforts by civil society will be key for culture's inclusion in the Pact for the Future. First, I would like to strongly encourage you to pursue advocacy efforts through your respective missions and representatives in New York. As you know, the negotiations in New York at the UN are not only member state-led, they are under the purview of foreign affairs ministries, not of culture ministries, foreign affairs. Germany and Namibia, as I said, will have a particular role to play as co-facilitators for the pact. And in addition, I would like to encourage you to push the advocacy towards the UN major groups and other stakeholders whose role will be pivotal. UNESCO stands ready to share language and advocacy material with you as need be and as you request. Overall, I feel that bringing forward the voice of civil society and other stakeholders in this process is a critical aspect, and UNESCO wishes to support your advocacy. We have several important events coming up this year. I would like to refer in particular to UNESCO's 16th International Forum of NGOs, which will take place in April in Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan. Culture will be strongly profiled, and the outcome of the conference regarding the advocacy for a standalone goal is likely to influence the negotiations in the run-up to the Summit of the Future. I would also like to encourage you to actively take part in other upcoming processes put forward by the UN, and notably the UN Civil Society Conference, which is planned in May 2024 in Nairobi, Kenya, and the regional forums on sustainable development that are planned to be organized by UN regional commissions between February and April 2024. I wish to thank you all for your attention. I remain available for any onward dialogue and to respond to questions if they come. And we look forward, of course, to continue engaging with you on synergies and joint efforts towards the positioning of culture in the post-2030 agenda. Thank you, Lars.
Thank you so much, Paola. Thanks for this very comprehensive and concise overview of where your work is at the moment, and also for your expression of support for the campaign and very concrete points of action that we can use as a hook for what's happening in New York at the moment, and also much broader. We certainly get back to that. We have a raised hand, but I would like you to collect your questions to the end, so that we give time to all the speakers first. Thank you. And on we go to Andrew Potts. Andrew, nice to see you here. Not as nice as seeing you last time in Venice during the Europa Nostra Summit, where I think you took a whole day of the summit program to talk about the Climate Heritage Network. So it's a big ask from us to you to summarize it in like 5 minutes, and especially also look at COP28 and the outcomes, and also the plans for the next 2 COPs. If I may ask you that, and how we can, how this could be better connected to our advocacy work. Big question, 5 minutes. Thanks for being with us, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Lars. As you say, in 5 minutes, I want to talk a little bit about the need and the opportunity to deepen the linkages between work on climate change and work on the Culture 2030 goal. And just by way of background, I want to underscore the profound ways that climate action and action for sustainable development are connected, not just as a policy matter, but as a scientific matter. Science tells us that at 2 degrees of global warming, the risk to achieving sustainable development, to reducing poverty, to reducing inequality are catastrophic. In fact, we already see sustainable development goals won in the past years being clawed back as a result of climate impacts. So it is incredibly difficult to achieve sustainable development in a 2 degrees warmer world. But at the same time, scientists have been unable to model pathways that get the world to holding global warming to 1.5 degrees at current levels of inequality and poverty. So in other words, unless poverty and inequality are reduced through sustainable development, science cannot model a way to get to the green transition needed to tackle climate change. And so we see how closely these 2 things are related. We have these 2 synergistic, sometimes at odds agendas, both monumental undertakings. And what we increasingly know is that these agendas can't proceed on parallel tracks. We can't have one climate change agenda and one sustainable development agenda. They have to be integrated. And there is a word for that integration called climate resilient sustainable development, or sometimes called climate resilient development pathways. A suggestion I have for the Culture 2030 goal is that I think we need to embed that idea a little bit more into our messaging. I think that concept will increasingly be influential in the articulation of the post-2030 agenda, but also culture has a particularly important role to play in this process. Culture is not only a vector of sustainable development, culture is not only a vector of climate action, culture is specifically a vector of the integration of the two, especially because of the way that culture helps modulate the trade-offs and the articulation of co-benefits that is really at the heart of merging these agendas. And UCLG does have a report on this topic, the role of culture in integrating climate action and sustainable development. Jordi put a link to it in the chat earlier. But just to say, I think that needs to loom a little bit larger in the Culture 2030 goal. So that's the first piece of background I want to share. The second has to do with climate planning and policy itself. There has been progress made in the effort to integrate culture into climate planning and policy. As Lars said, the UN's 2023 climate conference, COP28, wrapped up a few weeks ago in Dubai. And that conference arguably generated the most significant outcome for culture in COP history. There was the substantive inclusion of culture in some important decisions that were taken, the global goal on adaptation. But equally important were the enormous strides made in building out the policy infrastructure for putting culture at the heart of climate policy. COP28 saw the first ever multilateral high-level ministerial dialogue on culture-based climate action, where there was launched by 25 plus countries a new national government initiative called Group of Friends of Culture-Based Climate Action, co-chaired by Brazil and the UAE. And that group is now aiming to see the adoption at COP29 in Baku in November of a groundbreaking political decision on culture and climate action.
30 seconds, Andrew.
Yep. One of the outcomes of that ministerial is a thing called the Emirates Declaration on Culture-Based Climate Action. And I'll put a link to the chat in that. That declaration expressly acknowledges the Culture Goal 2030 and the connection between culture, sustainable development, and climate action. And so we already see the buildings of a synergy, of an alliance between taking culture forward in the climate context and taking it forward in the sustainable development context. And so I think that brings me to my very final observation on the Summit of the Future. I think the Summit of the Future is a good place to articulate these linkages, both in the context of the Culture 2030 goal and in the context of the campaign for this joint work decision, the political decision at COP29 on culture and climate that I mentioned. I know Stephen is going to present the submission that Culture 23 campaign made, but I do think there's a role to articulate this climate link more in the sustainable development pillar, but also in the youth and future generations pillar, where I think it fits especially well. And I think if we accomplish that, we will do quite a lot to strengthen the goals we're collectively aiming for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this concise overview, and also the term climate resilient sustainable development as a sort of alignment of the two agendas that put forth to our campaign. Thanks very much. On we go to Erminia Schiacchitano, Senior Advisor on Multilateral Affairs in the Minister's Cabinet of the Ministry of Culture in Italy. We've known each other from the European Year of Cultural Heritage before, which was a fantastic experience as well. So that's maybe a nice bridge from Andrew to you. You've been very important in the recent analysis and deliberations of the G7 and the G20. And I would like to ask you to explain your experience and the prospects for this year, 2024, from that experience.
Thanks, Lars.
So short as possible. I'm so sorry to rush through it.
No, I know. I will try to squeeze my message, because I fully understand that this process, G7 and G20 process, can sound a bit obscure. Well, I have to stress that both mechanisms, both the forum have engagement groups, but there is no engagement group on culture yet, at least. We successfully achieved the placing culture in this work stream, which is and which I should recall the fact that it's the focus of both G7 and G20 is economic focus, but the placing culture there was the first goal. the first goal. It's a kind of basso continuo for Italy to continue and to push on lifting the level and the consideration of culture at global level, in particular on the important role of culture for sustainable development. So we used all the opportunities. In 2017, we hosted the first G7 culture in Florence, and the G20 ministerial in 2021. And since I have shared the frustration of experiencing the path that led to the adoption of the current goals, I was very, very aware about the lack and importance of including culture. And in fact, in this declaration, thanks to the partnership, thanks to the strong engagement and support of UNESCO. So I thank Paola in particular for her huge work and support. We successfully not only included culture in the G20 work stream, but we also managed to include a reference to a call for the full recognition and integration of culture and the creative economy into development processes and policies as a driver and enabler for the achievement of the goals set out in the 2030 agenda. This document, the Rome Declaration, emphasizes also the importance of involvement of all levels of society, so including local communities and indigenous peoples, as it was stressed before. And also, as in relation to Andrew's intervention, also committed to upscale cultural dimension into climate change policies and mainstream cultural consideration in the global climate agenda, using the opportunity offered by the COP to raise awareness on global action on climate change and culture. This escalated to the G20 leaders, thanks to the Indonesian presidency, which has ensured continuity. More emphasis was placed on the role of local communities, indigenous peoples, and the role of living heritage at the heart of a renewed paradigm of sustainable living. And this, I think, it's a very important advancement. And finally, now last year, we had this incredible result, thanks to the incredible effort by the Indian presidency, which has managed to raise the ambition and includes not only a reference to the possible culture goal in the ministerial declaration, but including that reference in the leaders' declaration, which is the top level that we can achieve actually. So let me close saying that we are not stopping with these efforts. We will organize a G7 Culture Ministerial this year, which happens to be on the eve of the Summit of the Future. So, of course, strong references will be included and we will push for it. And Brazil is also continuing the work, is now chairing the G20 Culture Working Group, and is also considering an inclusive reflection on culture as a central element of sustainable inclusive development strategy. Thanks for the incredible for this webinar, because it was for me a very important source of information and inspiration, which I will use for sure during this year. Let's continue our work together.
Thanks so much, Erminia, and also thanks for sticking to the time and building that wonderful bridge with the important inclusion of the culture goal in the last G20 hosted by India, and that makes me welcome Lily Pandya. I hope you are there. I'm not so sure. I know that you had a meeting with your minister before, but you made it. Fantastic. Welcome to this conversation. You are the head of international cooperation at the Ministry for Culture in India and leader of the G20 Working Group on Culture in 2023. We've heard about the significance of that from Erminia already, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit in the 5 minutes that you have, and maybe focus also a little bit on the terms of policy effectiveness of national policies in the light of the cultural goals. So why is it important to have a cultural goal for your national policies? I think you are muted still. I can't hear you.
Sorry, yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Am I audible? All right. Namaste. Distinguished panelists, friends, colleagues, I am honored to speak here at this esteemed platform, convened to delve into culture's overarching and global impact on inclusive and sustainable development. As we inch closer to the first UN Summit of the Future this year, it is befitting time to collectively reflect on the next steps and envisaging ways to integrate culture in the post-2030 agenda. Now, culture not only stands as a distinct policy domain, but it also permeates a wide array of public policies, serving both as a catalyst and a facilitator for diverse developmental objectives. Now, this cross-cutting nature of culture resonates with the foundational principles of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Despite the absence of a specific SDG dedicated to culture, culture plays a pivotal role in achieving all the 17 SDGs. Its influence spans from poverty reduction, SDG 1, quality education, SDG 4, to employment, SDG 8, social justice, SDG 10, and environmental preservation, 13, and so on, with its significance explicitly recognized in numerous targets. The contribution of culture to sustainable development therefore extends beyond a mere sectoral role. It is integrated and transcends the social, economic, and environmental pillars of sustainable development. Now, in the contemporary context, culture has proven critical to ensuring rights-based and inclusive sustainable development models, encompassing the intrinsic diversity of societies and supporting the localization of SDGs. It serves as a conduit for intergenerational communication and learning, reinforcing social norms and values. India actively championed, with the help of Armenia, Paula, all of whom are present here today, and a big hello to all of them. We championed the Mundia Coles Declaration during our G20 presidency, emphasizing the integration of culture and its core ideals across the framework and future course of action. Now, the Culture Working Group of India's G20 achieved a unanimous endorsement of culture as a standalone goal beyond the 2030 agenda, reflected in the New Delhi Leaders Declaration and also our own outcome document, which was the Kashi Culture Pathway. Our 4 priorities: protection and restitution of cultural property, harnessing living heritage for a sustainable future, promotion of cultural and creative industries and creative economy, and leveraging digital technologies for protection and promotion of culture. We indulged in, this was a novelty that we introduced to explore the length and breadth of each priority. We actively indulged in knowledge building and sharing exercises through systematic, inclusive, and a widespread involvement of stakeholders and experts globally. This approach laid a solid foundation for understanding and kickstarting the culture-led development that engages communities as active participants in the process. The evolution of policy landscape towards a multipolar environment at both global and national levels, together with a gradual acceleration of digital transformation, has brought a paradigm shift in the discourse. However, the shift in the policy-making discussions remains to be fully translated into actual policy making. A profound rethinking of the public policy spectrum is required to fully encompass the specificity of the culture sector. Now, cultural factors encompass a wide range of elements, including language, religion, customs, social structures. Integrating these aspects into policy making requires an understanding of how they influence the way people perceive and respond to government initiatives. For instance, as India took on the mantle of G20 presidency, it also embraced the responsibility of steering the global conversations towards a more holistic, people-centric approach. It uniquely extended beyond the highest echelons of the government, as we saw an extensive Jan Bhagidari, which is people's participation, across the nation in various G20-led related events and activities, making it a people's G20. To evaluate the precise contribution made by the culture sector, establishing a culture satellite accounts systems at the national levels would also enable us to create robust evidence-based policy frameworks and policies that positively impact the beneficiaries. A culturally informed approach to policy making involves acknowledging and respecting the multifaceted nature of culture. By doing so, we create a more inclusive, adaptable, and effective policies that resonate with diverse populations, fostering a sense of shared responsibility. This approach shall ensure the long-term successful implementation of the intended policy. As we navigate the complexities of the ever-evolving global landscape, it is essential that we consistently engage in such fruitful dialogues and discussions as today's to empower us in moving forward. And in order to successfully position culture as a standalone goal in the post-2030 agenda, we need a strategic, collaborative, and innovative approach that serves as a shared blueprint, truly rooted and anchored in culture, for peace and prosperity, for people of the planet, for now and into the future. Beyond this, about some very specific things, culture and gender, culture and climate action, if there is a scope of interventions later on, I would delve into those. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. Also for kind of challenging us to put our thinking into the rethinking of the bigger policy picture. Thanks so much. We're rushing on to Stephen from the very heart of the campaign. We've answered to the co-chairs in preparation of the Pact of the Future document, a questionnaire on the contents. And maybe you can just in a few sentences or in a few minutes explain our answer, or in other words, our position in it.
Thank you so much. So in fact, with apologize, I'm actually going to invite Joanne Bouchard, the rapporteur on cultural rights offices, just to say a few words and make the connection, as we've heard, the connection with the G7, the G20, but also with the broader human rights agenda. So I think especially it's great that Joanne has been able to join us. So Joanne?
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thanks for everyone. This has indeed been extremely rich from the perspective of everyone that's contributing to the Culture Goal campaign. Just really a few words to complete, because Paola has taken the lead, which is great, to explain a little bit of the work that OHCHR has been doing together with UNESCO on pushing for more visibility of culture and cultural developments, but also of human rights and cultural rights inside of the Summit of the Future. So just a few words on the position of the OHCHR per se. There is interest from the side of the High Commissioner to push for that agenda as well. And through the Interagency Platform on Culture and Sustainable Development, where a number of UN agencies have been working together for some years now, there is work that is being done. Also working towards possible training material to strengthen our UN agencies in the field on how to plan, to monitor, and to integrate culture in the work that they do in the field, in the work that they do with communities at the country level, at the field level. And so we're starting to develop something that could be training material to help our colleagues at the UN agencies work together with communities, together with civil society on the ground, on pushing for more culture and cultural development in the SDGs and in the work of the UN agency. So this is something that is also being done in collaboration and to push for the cultural campaign. In terms of the work of the Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, Alexandra Santacchio, who is quickly with us, I just wanted to say that the mandate has been engaged since its creation in 2009 on the place of culture and cultural rights and sustainable development. And there has been 2 specific reports in the last few years published by the Special Rapporteur Alexandra Santacchio, with specific recommendations, also with language on how to strengthen a cultural rights and a human rights approach in that advocacy. So I'm just going to, in the chat in a moment, add the link to the new thematic page that has been developed with all the resources and all the positioning of the mandate on culture and sustainable development since its creation. Of course, also to the report and the recommendations, so that you have one place where you can go and just see the resources that have been developed by the mandate. And then just quickly, because a lot has been said already, so I don't want to take too much time, but definitely we see the necessity of having a human rights approach stronger. On the one hand, as was said and mentioned at the beginning, because the SDGs are supposed to be anchored in human rights, but human rights also give a stronger framework in terms of the obligations of states, where they don't have a pick and choose approach that some of you have mentioned, to just take the goals that they're performing better on, but really to look at a more holistic vision into what kind of development, what do we want, what kind of world do we want, what kind of society do we want to develop. And so how the culture and the cultural rights approach in this sense really enables us to strengthen the recognition of cultural diversity, which is sometimes absolutely lacking. It helps us also to focus more on the fact that every person counts. And so it should also include the question of those who have been migrating, those who have a feet in different realities, and what do they bring to that picture. And so to really have action on the ground and really an inclusive approach to the development processes that we want. So that's just a little thing on my side to just say how the OHHR has been and will continue to contribute to the campaign. And again, thanks to all of you for everything that you've brought to the discussion so far. This is really, really instructive.
Man, okay, Alexandra, you do want to come in the end. Great, welcome, nice to see you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much. And I'm sorry that I can't be here for longer. I just wanted to say, with Joan, we're going to play the good cup, bad cup. I'm going to be the bad cup. I just want to say that although a lot has been done, I think that we still have the majority of states who do not see this as a central issue, and a lot of them are trying to get out of discussions and of having it as a focus. I have been very disappointed how states block actually culture getting and cultural rights getting in discussions, and at times we seem to be satisfied just with a reference here and a reference there to cultural rights. So I think that the states who are here, the representatives who are here, but all of us have indeed to be encouraging and positive, but at the same time we have to be realistic. There's a lot more work to do. Maybe not among ourselves anymore, not among the converted, but with states. And I have to say from that at times I am becoming quite cynical when it comes to states' involvement. So we are looking for states that are going to push forward this agenda and are going to engage with us so that culture and cultural rights are talked about and are discussed in main fora, including the social forum, the SDG forum, and etc. Just focusing on cultural rights and sustainable development is great, but cultural rights and culture has to become a more dominant discussion and concept. Mm-hmm. And this is the end of the bad cup. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexander. Cautious of time and the fact that we have another slot after this one, well, just it's very rude and in a way a pity that we can't dive deeper into this. But Stephen, would you close this panel with your contribution, please?
Of course not. I'll try to do this in only a couple of sentences, and I can share the link to our submission on the proposals for the Summit of the Future so that people can see more. But I think we see in the Summit of the Future, the whole logic is to focus on how we do development and to find new and better ways of actually delivering on the commitments that are there. How do we empower the UN to do it? So I suppose the two things I really want to draw out are, firstly, our submission really emphasizes the narrative that's always been there from the UN, that we need to consider development holistically. We need to bring all elements in. We need to take integrated approaches, and that naturally involves culture. I think the point that Wafa was making earlier about culture being the same thing as localizing. So how do we actually get that on the agenda, reaffirm this progress and reaffirm the role of culture? And then I think the second major highlight of what we're saying here is that it would have been great if there had been a high impact initiative on culture at the time of the SDG summit last year. But I think we would love to see the summit in the future coming out with something that looks like one of these big, high-profile, high-impact initiatives, something concrete, so that we can really give profile to the work that UNESCO is doing, get countries really thinking about the role of culture, reporting on it, building up a bit of momentum ahead of preparation for whatever happens in 2030. So I'll put the link in the chat, but then hand back to you.
Okay, thanks very much. There was also a question in the chat whether we would summarize all the resources that have been mentioned today. Well, I can maybe just say that to invite everyone that has spoken to share the links and resources with us, and then we can probably compile it easily and share it, but we will need the help of everyone, to do that. I'll wrap this session up with maybe one or two questions, because I know that there was at least one question. There was one raised hand much earlier. If that raised hand has disappeared for good, then I'll say thank you to all the speakers of this panel. We are much over time, but your contribution has been invaluable. And I hand over to, actually, I don't know who's chairing that last bit. In any case, it's Lily and John that will rock the show. But Jordi, I guess back to you.
All right. I was not expecting that one, but why not? Thank you very much, Lars. Wonderful conduction of this extremely rich, interesting segment. We had the privilege of working with John Crowley in 2022 and in 2023. Around 2 years ago, in February 2022, we convened a similar webinar to this one because we wanted to be ready for Mondia Cult. Regional consultations for Mondia Cult had taken place, and members of the campaign, members of the 7 members of the steering committee we were asking to ourselves, which is our message to Mondia Cult? So we convened the webinar, and we almost unanimously discovered or noticed that the culture goal advocacy was very, very much shared, very mature. As we have explained earlier, we launched a survey, and with the survey and several discussions among us and the great work of John, we published on the eve of Mondia Cult the report, the document, the 0 draft of the culture goal for the post-2030 agenda. Now we have been working with John in 2022-23. This is January 24, and the UN SDG summit mentioned certainly the place of culture in development, more profound mentions in the G20, in the BRICS, in the Council of Ministers of European Union, and certainly our advocacy, and here I want to emphasize the work of IFLA and ICOMOS in reaching out all the national committees they have. We believe that our work is reaching more and more member states of the UN. I would like to emphasize also the words of Paola Leoncini Bartoli. Ministers for culture need, and we all need to convince the ambassadors and the foreign affairs ministries. They are the one negotiating in New York. From John, we also learned that we do not only need the cultural actors or those who identify as cultural actors, sectors, but also the complicity of our closest circles, environmental activists, education, feminist movement, other NGOs, academia. So yeah, open question to John. How have you lived this period of advocacy, these 2 years, and what are the steps that you would recommend us to undertake in the next months?
Thank you, Jordi. Pleasure to be back with all of you, many of whom I've had the pleasure of discussing with on previous occasions on these topics. Some of you I'm meeting for the first time. Hello to everyone, and thanks for some of the positive comments in the chat. So much has already been said that it's actually not easy to intervene at this stage, because I agree with all the points made, and some of them were really important. I won't try to summarize everything, but perhaps focus on the question, advocacy for what, which can perhaps help distinguish 3 separate sets of issues, which have different timelines, different kinds of challenges, and perhaps different technical requirements. First, advocacy for the idea that culture is really important for the Sustainable Development Agenda. Second, advocacy for a culture goal in the post-2030 development framework. And third, advocacy for the principle that we can't wait until 2030. And all of those principles are important. I think they will be widely shared here, but they have different kinds of implications. The second has been well discussed, and Paola and Alexandra in particular have made some very important points about it. The process of advocating for the inclusion of a culture goal, perhaps using as a basis the zero draft that we worked on in 2022 and published at the time of Mondiacult, as Jordi mentioned, could be a very important basis for that advocacy. But a lot of what's going to happen is going to happen behind closed doors, as Paola said, among governments, which are increasingly jealous of the purely intergovernmental nature of their deliberations. That phrase, purely intergovernmental process, is something I first saw, and it struck me a lot when I was still working for UNESCO in January 2012, when I was part of a discussion within the Secretariat about the run-up to the Rio +20 conference and the process by which civil society and the specialized agencies would intervene in the development of what eventually became the outcome document of Rio +20. And I perhaps naively assumed that UNESCO would continue to have an important role in the development of the outcome. And then we received, sometime in January 2012, I might even still have a copy of the document somewhere, I'm sure Paola does, a document from New York summarizing the state of negotiations and emphasizing very explicitly that member states hitherto, from January up to the conference itself in June, wanted a purely intergovernmental process, I quote, for the finalization. Everyone else locked out. That's what behind closed doors means. It's not just the staging of the meeting, it's the principle that other voices no longer count. So the only way of creating leverage for that is indeed through the national level. Convincing, now national level doesn't necessarily mean every person within his or her own territorial jurisdiction, but without the member state champions to take forward both the principle of a goal and the actual architecture of a goal, there's not a lot that can be done from the outside to force that agenda. And of course, a reminder of the timeline, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in September 2015 by the UN General Assembly. A lot had already been locked down for all practical purposes by spring 2012. And the same thing will happen again, simply because that's the dynamic and the timeline of the international system, which means that by sometime in 2027, on the basis of a process that is not currently known in any detail, it will be too late for advocacy for that particular purpose. But, and this is the positive side of the cautionary message that Alexandra in particular emphasized a few minutes ago, that's only part of the issue. The Sustainable Development Goals are important. In my experience, they've been particularly important, I don't know if others have the same experience, in creating a shared language for discussing sustainable development across very diverse groups of stakeholders at different levels, in different sectors, and with different interests. And a good example of this is the way in which the corporate agenda of sustainability has adopted the Sustainable Development Goals as not just guiding principles, but operational metrics for doing certain things. Now, you might argue that what's done is mainly greenwashing, but to know how to greenwash, you have to know what shade of green you're expected to do the washing in. So there is a sense in which even greenwashing, to borrow a very old phrase, is the homage that vice pays to virtue. Recognizing that this is the common language within which even cheating has to be framed in order to be credible. And that sounds like a cynical comment, but it's actually a very important one, because everything we do is shaped by language. And the transformation of language is actually one of the important ways through which, at the political, diplomatic, institutional level, the world is changed, for better or for worse. We could do a whole seminar, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with these arguments, on how the neoliberal revolution of the late 1970s successfully changed the language of politics and policy in a way that only made it possible, henceforth, to discuss things in neoliberal terms. And the only question was whether you were a center-left neoliberal or a center-right neoliberal. Well, something of the same power of language can be expressed through the successful advocacy for culture as an integral component of the Sustainable Development Goals, based not just on its importance, but also on a credible technical architecture. And this is what we tried to do in the Zero draft, taking it down to the level of specific targets, showing the kinds of targets that would need to exist in order to reflect the transversal importance of culture, not just the various culture-specific targets, but also the transversal targets embedded within a culture goal. For those familiar with the architecture of the Sustainable Development Goals, the idea was to borrow from the architecture of Sustainable Development Goal 16, which has some similarities indeed to the challenge and ambition of a culture goal, because it's dealing with peace, justice, and inclusion, which is an incredibly broad set of issues, many of which are quite soft, and which it's not always easy to isolate, because of course, peace, justice, and inclusion are a precondition for the achievement of everything in the SDGs, not just a separate set of issues, which is why, and this is both technically slightly bizarre, but also very important conceptually and practically. If you look at the targets of SDG 16, there are numbered targets, and then at the end, two targets that don't have numbers, but letters, A and B. And targets A and B are the targets with respect to which SDG 16 is supposed to be contributing to the framework for all of the other SDGs. And that kind of technical architecture is indispensable to avoid the potential trap of confining culture to a sector, recognizing that everything in the SDGs is actually of a cultural nature. Andrew said some very important things about climate change earlier that I'd like to echo, because in a purely professional sense, this is my core business. Much of what I do is about the environmental dimension of sustainable development, including the cultural dimension of the environmental dimension. And the evidence that increasingly we have of the importance of cultural change in building climate resilience is part of the lateral connections between future SDG 18 and current and perhaps future SDG 13. And that connection with SDG 13 can also be built for basically all the other SDGs. And that task, which has been mentioned by many of you in very interesting ways, and which I think is probably shared by a group such as this, is part of the bridge between advocacy for the first point, that culture is really important, and advocacy for the second point, that its importance cannot be fully captured without a technically coherent, ambitious, and fully integrated culture goal. I'm not sure that message has been taken on board at this stage. But that's what's worth advocating for. And it can only, that's the key conclusion, be advocated for within the rules of that particular game. The rules of intergovernmentalism, not true multilateralism, and the rules of a certain technical architecture, which may evolve, of course. The future post-2030 SDGs, or whatever they might be called, might have a somewhat different technical architecture. But there will be common features, because they're just part of how the UN needs to work. And there will also be a search for continuity for a very simple, practical political reason, which is that if you open up everything for discussion, there is a very real risk that the whole agenda will collapse. And everyone knows that. And those most committed to the Sustainable Development Agenda are the most worried that if you open up the discussion too much, everything will collapse, which is why talking about SDG 18 is the right approach. Assume a high degree of continuity and make sure that culture is part of the future. But of course, that's not sufficient to define a full advocacy strategy. And then the final point. 2030 is a long way away. Even 2027 is a long way away. We can't afford to wait. And this is one of the big advantages of the approach through a culture goal, a fully worked out draft culture goal available for adoption within the intergovernmental process, is that it can be picked up and run with immediately by those who care. And the ability of those who care to show that it makes a positive difference will actually contribute to its credibility for those that are not yet convinced. Now, there are some challenges there, and I'm sure that some in the conversation might be slightly disappointed because you can't be as radical as you might want to be if you want to get acceptance. But the caution about being too radical applies to intergovernmental take-up. It doesn't apply to action to achieve sustainable development through full integration of culture on the ground. The Sustainable Development Agenda defines a set of goals, targets, and indicators that are the common language of the international community in that area, and which are proposed for adoption as guidelines, frameworks, inspiration by anyone at any level working in the same area. But no one ever said that's all you're allowed to do. You can do as much as you want on top of that. And I think this has been one of the gaps so far, one of the perhaps failures of the SDG framework. It was supposed to inspire not compliance, but imagination. And if you look at the corporate world, but also the world of local authorities and the world of public institutions generally, then you will see probably more compliance than imagination. Fortunately, there are great examples of imagination, including the ones that Jordi works on, and there are local authorities in particular that have taken the lead on this. But still, the name of the game is mainly, let's make sure we're ticking the boxes. But that restriction can be overcome simply by wanting to do it at the levels at which any particular individual, group of individuals, institution wants to act, whether locally, transnationally, nationally, where a government is supportive, or through business and the voluntary sector. And I think the key in moving forward in 2024 will be to articulate in the right way those three dimensions of advocacy. Emphasizing the crucial importance of culture. I don't need to repeat everything that was said earlier about what you lose when you ignore culture in the various areas that the Sustainable Development Framework covers, including those that no one particularly mentioned because there wasn't time to deal with everything, but questions about health and about food and about sustainable production and consumption, or about the oceans, which is an area that's recently become important for me because I've taken on a new role as ambassador for an ocean protection label I'll tell you about it if you're interested. All of those lateral connections need to be emphasized. In full coherence with the ambition of creating intergovernmental support for a cultural goal in the technically required circumscribed sense, and at the same time creating a dynamic whereby, without waiting for the post-2030 development framework, those who are committed are acting on their conviction of the importance of culture through means that are compatible with the shadow goal. Maybe that's what we can call it for these purposes, which is the goal that people are acting by even before it's been formally adopted. And the last word on this. By sometime in 2027, if it's not obvious that there should be a culture goal, there won't be one. And obvious is very powerful in the international system. When things need to be debated, they'll probably get taken off the table to produce consensus. So our real challenge, if you boil it down to the absolute essence of the challenge, is that over the course of about 3 years, tight timetable, it becomes obvious at the intergovernmental level that there will be and should be a culture goal, so that the discussion is only about the details of how exactly to do it. That's a high bar, but that's, I think, the scale of the ambition we should be collectively committing to, and then, of course, discussing how to do it. Thanks,
Thank
Jordi.
you. Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for this great list, a great ambition, great friendly approach to the work that we are doing. I'm not going to open the floor for comments because we would spend another hour. But what I can do is to promise that on behalf of the campaign, we will certainly be working in that new document, ambitious as it was the first one, the zero draft. Probably that goes in the direction you have pointed out. 3 minutes to 3 o'clock GMT, 4 o'clock in Barcelona. I'll give the floor to the members of the campaign, to Lars, Steven, Celia, Gabe, Ege, and Marie-Julie, and Babilas in Cebu, if you wish to. Please, Lars, if you want to go first. 1 minute.
No, I just want to thank all the contributors from the bottom of my heart, because for my understanding of how our campaign is embedded and interlinked with other policy dynamics going on, and which opportunities there really are for us to take next steps, it was really eye-opening for me, and I believe that it has reinforced our powers to make it happen. As John said, it's the one obvious thing. It can't fail. Thanks to everyone.
Marie-Julie?
Thank you. Yes, I want to thank everybody. Eye-opener is definitely the word. That was extremely interesting to hear all the views today. Maybe I will use this opportunity to just bring your attention to an event that will happen in Quebec City in May. We will welcome 18 experts from UNESCO on May 27. They have the mandate to do recommendation on the digital environment, and it will be their first meeting. So definitely SDG will be part of the discussion. We organize a day of conference from the civil society perspective on May 27. So we will try to make the discussion continue on that event.
Ege, Gabe?
Just a note about not only eye-opening, but also reinforces our resolution to keep on track and keep our focus on the goal and the target. And as was said, keep working strategically, especially with the government actors. And it's very good to see everyone again. Thank you.
For me, it's really also eye-opening, but at the same time, the power of these engagements is also talking to governments and really the people who decide. I think we have to take the train and be part of this process, not just from civil society, but to really talk to our governments and really engage from that point.
Celia? We cannot hear you, Celia.
Now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Thank you to everybody also for their generosity and being with us for 3 hours and sharing their approaches, their ideas. And for us as a campaign, I think the most important, one of the important points is that we were able to bring together many like-minded people, not only from the cultural sector, but in our bid to really create a strong alliance around this culture goal. And yes, John said we have to, the bar is high, make it obvious that there is a need for the culture goal. I was also very interested to learn about possibilities during this year with the regional consultations. So let's just keep up the good work and be stronger with many more partners across around in this alliance. Thank you.
Stephen?
I don't think I can really add much to what's already been said so far, but simply say I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. I think it's great, as said, to have these different policy perspectives here on this call. I hope that we'll hear culture present in calls and discussions in other policy areas. But I think this really launches us off very well for 2024.
Thank you very much. One of the reasons, let me conclude with this. One of the reasons there is no culture goal in today's Agenda 2030 is on our shoulders. The cultural, so-called identified as cultural actors, were weak and disconnected in 2011-12. Now, this is not the reality. We are connected, we are strong. So we walk together this year, 2024, and the next years for the progress of our institutions, organizations, but mainly for the progress of the humanity as a whole, and for the need of the cultural dimension to be more at the center, more visibly in the lives of everyone on Earth. Thank you. We'll see again very soon. Thank you again. Thank you to all the speakers, your generosity, and to all the participants too. Thank you again. See you soon.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.